All right, hello, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn series. My name is Giza Lopez, and I am the Executive Director of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. On behalf of the YJI, I am happy to welcome each of you to this month's webinar. It's been a while. Thank you for joining us today in this virtual space, and thank you for making time to learn more about youth justice research. At this point, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're logging in from. I want to give a shout out to our partners in New York State, the Division of Criminal Justice Services, the Office of Children and Family Services, the University at Albany, and the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. We thank all of them for their support. And I also want to personally thank the YJI folks who have been working really hard behind the scenes to bring today's webinar to you. They are Gianna Fiorello, Avery Irons, Megan Willows, Tori Kinoki, Mira Bhatt, and Nick Gonzalez. I think we also have Brianna Caetano helping out in the audience. So thank you to each of you. As you log in, I see some familiar names here in the virtual crowd. So I want to acknowledge the presence of a few of our Youth Justice Peer Advisory Council members. Hello, Ethan. We appreciate you, and we appreciate the work that our young people are doing in that space. Today, it is our pleasure to host Dr. Catherine Kimbrell. Like all of you, I'm looking forward very much to her presentation. It is wonderful to have you, Dr. Kimbrell. And today we also welcome a new host to our series, our wonderful research and evaluation specialist, Alicia Gagnon. So to introduce Dr. Kimbrell properly and to lead us in this conversation today, here's Alicia. Take it away, Alicia.
Thank you, Giza. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Youth Justice Institute Lunch and Learn series. My name, as Giza said, is Alicia Gagnon, and I'm the Research and Evaluation Specialist at the YJI. Today, we bring to you some cutting-edge research on juvenile justice issues in what we hope is an engaging and thought-provoking format. Today's topic is Restorative Justice Programs and Practices, presented by Dr. Catherine Kimbrell, a Senior Research Associate at the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy within the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society at George Mason University. Dr. Kimbrell received her PhD in Criminology, Law, and Society from GMU in 2019. Her dissertation focused on the impact of poverty on the pretrial system, for which she was awarded a Philip M. Dearborn Fellowship from the Economic Club of Washington, D.C. She received her MA in Criminal Justice from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and her BS in Justice Studies with a second degree in German Language and Literature from James Madison University. She was most recently a senior associate at the Pew Charitable Trusts, working on the jails team for the Public Safety Performance Project. Dr. Kimbrell is a past German Chancellor Fellow with the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, during which she conducted research on victim offender mediation in Germany. Her primary research interests include adult and juvenile evidence-based treatment and crime prevention programs and policies, research synthesis, and restorative justice. She currently serves as a managing editor for Criminology and Public Policy. Her presentation today is titled Restorative Justice Programs and Practices in Juvenile Justice, the Research Evidence. So without further ado, Dr. Kimbrell, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I also want to thank everyone at the Youth Justice Institute for having me here today. Restorative justice is a topic I've been passionate about and interested in for a very long time, so I'm very excited to be able to present on this research and topic. And I also want to thank everyone that's here today from all over New York and other states throughout the country. Really appreciate you spending your lunchtime with me and with all of us here today as well. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so as Alicia mentioned, the title of this presentation is Restorative Justice Programs and Practices in Juvenile Justice, the Research Evidence. And the research evidence in particular will be coming from a recent meta-analysis that was completed within the past year and recently published in Criminology and Public Policy. So I will be presenting on this new research. As Alicia also mentioned, I currently work at the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy at George Mason University. And as the name suggests, we really focus on evidence-based research and using that research to help inform policy and practice. Another important component of evidence-based crime policy is translating research, so making it more easily digestible and understood. So that's also a goal of my presentation here today. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. I would like to acknowledge the co-authors of the study I'll be speaking about today, and that is Dr. David Wilson, who's at George Mason as well, and Dr. Ajima Alagre. We've really worked as a team doing a number of meta-analyses on different juvenile justice topics, so I'd like to mention them as well. And I also want to mention our funder, which was the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. They funded the first meta-analysis that we conducted on this topic, and the topic I'll be presenting today, or the research I'll be presenting today, was an update from that original funded research. All right, so in an ideal world where we would all be together during this lunch hour, we would hopefully be able to introduce ourselves, give a little bit of our background, say where we're from. So I wanted to launch a quick interactive poll, and there'll be another poll in this presentation to line things up and make things a little bit more interactive. So I'm hoping everyone can share a little bit about where you're coming from. And if you want to also, I know a lot of people are already introducing themselves in the chat, but continue to add a little bit about your background. Please feel free to answer the poll. All right, looks like we've got a lot from state and local government, some social workers, practitioners. All right, I think we can end the poll, Alicia, if you'd like. All right, so this is just helpful to have us all see, you know, where we're all coming from. We've got some educators, some attorneys as well. So we've got a wide variety of people joining us today, which is great. I'm gonna remove the poll. All right, so now we have a better sense of who is here today. I just want to provide a very quick overview of what I'll be talking about today. First, I'm going to provide a little bit of background on what restorative justice is, both in theory and in practice, and I'll briefly discuss what exactly is a meta-analysis before we get into the study that was conducted, as well as the results and discussion. All right, so before getting to the study, I want to talk about what exactly is restorative justice. How do we define this? And I've pulled a quote from really one of the absolute founders of the restorative justice movement, and that's Howard Zehr. And Howard Zehr writes that restorative justice requires, at a minimum, that we address the harms and needs of those harmed, hold those causing harm accountable to put right those harms, and involve both these parties as well as relevant communities in this process. So while I start this presentation by providing a quote of a specific definition, the reality is that there are many debates about restorative justice and how exactly to define it, both theoretically and in terms of how it should be applied in practice. So this can really lead to some challenges, as you might imagine, when we get to studying these types of programs and practices. Nevertheless, there really are common themes and common values that we do see across these programs, including really the centrality of the victim in the process, holding the responsible party or the offender accountable, and righting the wrongs or trying to come to a resolution to repair the harm. So moving from definitions and a little bit of the background of theory into what do these programs look like in reality and in practice. this Venn diagram or this figure or illustration really shows us the variability of restorative justice programs and practices. We see, the three stakeholders that are commonly included: the victim, the community, and the responsible party or the offender. And we see that some of these programs really focus more on, one specific stakeholder over another, whereas other programs, like the ones in the middle, which are often maybe considered to be more fully restorative, might incorporate all three stakeholders. This Venn diagram also really highlights the fact that a lot of people feel that there's a wide range of how restorative a program may be. So there might be some programs here that some of you are more familiar with than other programs, but the most popular program in the United States, and probably the program most are familiar with, is a program called victim offender mediation. Other common programs that people are often familiar with when they think of restorative justice includes family group conferencing, or peace circles or community conferencing. And the theme that all three of these or four of these programs share is that they involve a face-to-face meeting guided by a third-party facilitator or mediator between a willing, someone who's agreed to participate, a victim, and the youth or responsible individual, coming together as a result of a crime or a harm that's been done. And the goal of the mediation is really to discuss the harms that were caused as a result of the crime, to actually talk about what happened, to get a little bit of clarity or have answers, questions answered that the victim might have, and for the parties to really reach an agreement on how to make things right. When we think about victim offender mediation, often this involves just a victim and an offender. The family group conferencing then goes to expand a little bit larger, include the family, potentially a police officer, and then peace circles or other types of circle programs then even get even larger and include, community members or others that are wanting to be involved in the circle. But the reality is that sometimes, even though there are these neatly defined labels for these types of programs, there can also be a little bit of a mix, right? So sometimes we see in victim offender mediation that family members are invited, or maybe we'll see in a family group conference that a community member is involved as well. So again, this just highlights the reality that these programs can be a little bit amorphous at times and include different elements. Another way of looking at, the differences between these types of programs is to really view restorative justice as a continuum. And I highlight this slide because this was the philosophy or the approach that we wanted to take when we conducted our meta-analysis. So we didn't want to focus on one specific program, given the reality that there are so many programs out there and that a lot of them might look different ways. But this belief of, restorative justice should be viewed as a continuum really views restorative justice programs and practices on kind of a scale from maybe more informal to more formal. So from potentially less restorative, so a program that might include just a single element like restitution, to more restorative, so a program that might be exclusively on, restorative justice principles such as a circle or VOM. And then maybe somewhere in between. So programs that maybe blend restorative justice with non-restorative justice elements or include multiple elements such as hybrid programs. So Kathleen Daly is an academic who has written extensively on this, and she really argues that we should view restorative justice as a continuum and make this, concept more comprehensive. So this was, again, something that we really relied on when we conducted our meta-analysis. So next, I just want to briefly talk about restorative justice and recidivism. Recidivism was one of the main outcomes that we wanted to look at in our study. And a lot of times, the evaluation literature on this topic often overlooks this discussion. So we wanted to talk a little bit about why should we expect restorative justice programs and practices to work in the first place? And one of those explanations is reintegrative shaming theory, which was posed by, again, another really founder of, in many ways, the restorative justice movement, which is John Braithwaite. And he really argued that, youth will ultimately refrain from committing crimes in the future when they are respectfully shamed for their actions by those that care about them and their community, as opposed to stigmatized and then reintegrated back into society. So holding youth accountable, but then still bringing them back into the community following being held accountable for their actions. Procedural justice is another theory that's been forth to kind of explain why we believe restorative justice may impact recidivism. And here the argument is essentially how individuals are treated in the process of being involved in the criminal justice system matters, right? So things like fairness and satisfaction may make individuals more likely to comply in the future if they feel that they have been treated fairly throughout the process. And the final explanation that's also been posed as well is that behavioral change may occur following youth's recognition of the harm caused to the victim. So better understanding and gaining empathy as well. So before we get into the explanation of the study, I wanted to just very briefly talk about this large word, meta-analysis. So what exactly is a meta-analysis? Some of you may be very familiar with what a meta-analysis is. Others might have heard it often, quoted on NPR, things like that. But a meta-analysis essentially statistically summarizes the results of separate but similar studies. So the study I'll be speaking about today, we were looking at effective studies that evaluated the effectiveness of restorative justice programs and practices. So we want to look for just studies that kind of focus on this research question. Meta-analyses are both comprehensive and systematic. They're comprehensive in the sense that I like to kind of highlight, it's like you're throwing a net out into the ocean and you're trying to bring in as much as you can in terms of all the studies that are out there that cover this topic. And then they're also systematic. We go through a very rigorous process of ensuring that we are capturing studies that are of high quality, that we're not leaving any leaf unturned. We're trying to get as much as we can to really analyze the full body of research on this topic. So meta-analyses go through often these 5 steps, again, identifying the research, again, research that focuses on these questions, retrieving those studies, coding those studies, analyzing them, and then ultimately, reporting the results. So why are meta-analyses so important? Ultimately, they're extremely valuable in informing policy and practice regarding what works, what doesn't, what's promising, and what we don't know yet. And they're also really helpful because we're not focusing on one study or the results from one study or a few studies. We're focusing on, again, high quality research results from many different studies. So a culmination, again, of the research evidence. And meta-analyses are also helpful because they're a helpful resource for informing evidence-based policies in criminology. And that brings us to the present study. So as I previously mentioned, this meta-analysis that was conducted was updated from a 2017 meta-analysis that was conducted on the exact same topic. And we were really interested in updating this meta-analysis, even just, I think, 3 years later, because of the increased popularity and growth around the topic of restorative justice. As many of you that are on this call might be familiar with, we've really seen an explosion of interest in the topic of restorative justice, both as a diversion approach to juveniles, as well as in school settings as well, to kind of address the school to prison pipeline and the impact on zero tolerance policies. So given that, we really felt that it was important to keep policymakers and practitioners up to date on the effectiveness of these programs. So the present study focused on all juvenile justice programs that incorporated restorative justice principles or practices. So if we think back to that continuum, we wanted to focus on, again, all restorative justice programs and practices and be not super restrictive. So our study aims were threefold. First, we wanted to look at how effective restorative justice programs for youth were involved in the juvenile justice system in reducing future delinquent behavior. We also wanted to look at how effective these programs for youth involved in the juvenile justice system were in addressing other non-delinquency outcomes for both victims and youth participants. And we also wanted to look at the relative effectiveness of different restorative justice program types. So those programs labeled as a victim offender mediation program, as well as components, so elements of these specific programs for youth involved in the juvenile justice system. So similar to those research questions, our outcomes of interest included delinquency. So any measure of criminal behavior, for example, arrest or police contact, could be official or self-report. And then non-delinquency outcomes, both focused on the victim, such as satisfaction, perceptions of fairness, as well as the responsible party, which includes similar outcomes like satisfaction and fairness, but as well as attitudes about delinquency. So our methodology, we really followed pretty standard systematic review and meta-analysis processes and techniques. As I previously mentioned, we identified studies, and here I'll just note that the studies we included were only randomized control trials. So for those that are less familiar with the term, this includes a treatment group in the restorative justice program or practice, and then a control group, and they're randomly assigned. Think of flipping a coin to each of the groups. And then we also did include quasi-experimental studies. So these types of studies are similar in that they also have a treatment group and a control group, but they are not randomly assigned. So we only included studies that met that criteria, and then we had other eligibility criteria, like they had to, youth had to be 18 and under and things like that. And then we retrieved the studies, and then we coded the studies. So this is a very technical and long process, but we coded all studies for study characteristics, for the nature of the treatment and control. So better understanding, what type of program did they go to, what were characteristics of those programs, the nature of the people that were involved, and then the research. So again, what kind of study was conducted and what were the findings. And then ultimately we calculate what's called an effect size. So effect sizes are very important in meta-analyses, and these ultimately reflect the magnitude and the direction of the difference between the treatment and control group for that specific outcome of interest. The effect size that we calculated in this meta-analysis is called a standardized mean difference. So I don't want to get too technical for this presentation. So for those of you that are really interested in the nitty-gritty fine details, I do encourage you to check out the recent publication or the previous technical report for the methodology. And I do provide a citation at the end of the presentation, again, for those that are interested. And then finally, the final element is to report the outcomes and to make sense of it all, right? So what did we ultimately find here? So we ultimately found 57 unique studies that we coded, which is a lot. So this was a pretty large meta-analysis, and we coded 631 effect sizes. We found that the majority of studies came from the United States, and then the remaining countries included Australia, the EU, and Canada. We only included studies that provided the results in English, so that could have been potentially a limitation, but we did have a large variety of studies coming from, some different countries. In terms of when the studies were conducted, the largest percentage were conducted in the 2000s, 42%, followed by 2010s, and then the 1990s, about equal between those two decades. In terms of the study design, nearly a quarter included, again, that gold standard, the highest kind of quality study, the randomized control trials, followed by, we kind of then divided the quasi-experiments into high-quality quasi-experiments, so those that use potentially additional statistical controls or matching, making them just a little bit more rigorous, and then low-quality quasi-experimental studies, so those that essentially didn't. So the vast majority, did include quasi-experimental studies in this meta-analysis. So what were these studies looking at? What were the types of programs that these studies were evaluating? Not too surprisingly, we found that 37%, or the largest percent, were evaluating what we classified as victim offender conferencing. So as some of you might be familiar with, a lot of the titles of these programs have changed or morphed over the years, or maybe back in the 1970s, 80s, we saw victim offender reconciliation programs, then those changed to victim offender mediation. Sometimes we see restorative conferencing, but groups that were essentially just involving a victim and offender together, we grouped into a victim offender conference group. The next largest group we classified were hybrid or other programs. So these programs didn't neatly fit into one of the kind of predefined types of restorative justice program or practice, but might have included a blend of different approaches, or might have included a blend of a justice system approach with a restorative justice system approach. So those made up about 20%. Then we saw the remaining programs were restitution, teen youth court, and then less than 10% were family group conference, arbitration mediation, and then impact panels and reparative boards. So we were also really interested in coding, irrespective of the name of the program, what were the elements that these programs were including? What were the mechanisms? What were they actually doing? We were really interested in evaluating this. And this could have been across studies. So we saw that the most commonly used method or element was to use a facilitator or a mediator, to have a face-to-face meeting, followed by restitution, having the victim present, including a restorative agreement, so the agreement that's reached at the end of an actual mediation, and then community service. Other elements that were also included were family involved or present, pre-conference mediation, community involved, apology, and follow-up compliance. So in terms of the study characteristics across both, the control and treatment groups, both groups included adjudicated and diverted youth. Unfortunately, we were really interested again in coding the specific characteristics of study participants, such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, but this was missing from too many studies to provide a reasonable description across studies. And you can already see here, this is a good flag for future research, should do a better job at this, but that was certainly something we were interested in looking at and could not. All right, so now we get to the interesting stuff. What did we ultimately find in this meta-analysis? Before getting to the results, I want to share a little bit of a perspective to help us better understand what do we make with some of these numbers that I'll be talking about. And that perspective is that the most effective programs that are identified by meta-analyses on juvenile justice programs and interventions have effects in the 0.40 to 0.5 range. And this is from Professor Mark Lipsey, who has really done the most work on meta-analyses, or one of the people that's done the most work on meta-analyses on juvenile justice programs and interventions. So I provide that just as a little bit of context before getting into these specific results. But overall, when we looked at recidivism across all of those studies, we found that the pattern of evidence does show promising results. So ultimately, we found a small to moderate effect with a standardized mean difference of 0.23. So again, a promising result, and this was statistically significant. However, the little caveat here is that when we did focus just on the more rigorous studies, or specifically, again, those randomized control trials, we did see about the effect half, essentially, from 0.23 to 0.09. So we did see smaller effects there. Nevertheless, we didn't see any evidence of what's called a backfire effect. So essentially being involved in these programs leading to recidivism. So that is also positive. All right, so I thought we could, again, have a little interactive poll here. And now that you heard the results from the delinquency findings, I just want to ask everyone to quickly share what you think. Was hearing about that surprising? Was it essentially what you expected? I was going to, oh yeah, Alicia can launch the poll. Yeah, not sure processing, forgot about that one. All right. So it seems like some of you are, about half are still processing these results. And then the next largest is, I think a lot of people already thought that this was going to be what they were going to find. And that's very understandable. It's a lot to process for those that put that. All right. So next we were interested in looking at delinquency effects by, again, the specific types of restorative justice programs that we did classify. And we found that 2 programs did show promise. And that was the victim offender conferencing group, where we saw a small to moderate effect, and then the hybrid other program group, where we saw a moderate to large effect, with the standardized mean difference is about 0.38. Unfortunately, none of the other programs did show, positive results, or we're still less certain about those. But we did see that these 2 program groups showed promise. Family group conferences and victim impact panel or reparative boards, we are saying that there might be some potential promise. I think we still need to delve a little bit deeper into this group. We did see small to moderate and large effects respectively for both of these groups, but this was only for one evaluation, and that evaluation was a quasi-experimental study. So more research should be done there. For the non-delinquency results, this was really where we saw our most promising findings. So the most promising findings were really found here with these non-delinquency outcomes, in particular for victim participants. So for those that are advocates of, restorative justice and the centrality of the victim in the process, these results are certainly promising. When looking specifically at fairness, we saw a large effect for both participants. So for both victim participants, as well as youth participants in the group. So they both felt, when compared to their counterparts in the control group, that these programs were much fairer, or they felt that the process was fair. In terms of satisfaction, we also saw a large effect, but this was only statistically significant for the victim group. And interestingly, the youth group was still, though, satisfied, but it wasn't statistically significant. But if you look at this effect size of 0.71, this is the largest effect size that we see across the entire study. So I think this is very important to highlight that the victims were incredibly satisfied with these programs and practices. So the final thing that we were interested in looking at was, again, those specific elements of these restorative justice programs and practices. And we were interested in seeing what is potentially driving these reductions in recidivisms. If you can recall, a few slides prior, I highlighted the elements that we coded, such as the mediator being involved, the victim being present, a pre-mediation, things like that. So we put all of those elements only from the high quality quasi-experimental studies and the randomized control studies into a meta-regression model predicting recidivism. And unfortunately, we didn't really find anything. So that was certainly a little bit disappointing. So we do really see an overall positive pattern of restorative justice, but we still don't really know what's going on inside that black box. So what's ultimately contributing to that reduction. All right, so I want to conclude with just 4 quick takeaways here. So how do we kind of digest all of this? Takeaway number 1, overall, we do see promising results for restorative justice programs and practices. Looking at the collection of evidence from all of these studies that we evaluated, we saw a small to moderate reduction in future delinquency with no evidence of a backfire effect. So if we were to kind of try to put this in one of those buckets of what works, what doesn't, we would say this is what's promising. So we do feel that these programs are promising given the evidence, and even given when looking at the just high quality studies. Takeaway number 2. We do see mixed support when looking at those specific restorative justice programs. We see that the most promising results are for the victim offender and the hybrid other programs. That's also arguably very promising for, restorative justice, given the fact that victim offender conference type programs are still the most popular programs, often in the United States and around the world. And then finally, the impact on delinquency for the remaining programs appears less promising or less clear, but we do need additional research on some of those specific other programs, such as family group conferencing or the impact panels. Takeaway number 3, we do really need better descriptions of restorative justice practices evaluated and of the participants. As I said previously, we didn't even have enough information on the specific study participants to analyze anything meaningfully there. And really our meta-regression model was only as good as the studies in terms of how well they describe the practices and elements. So for example, if a study might have included a mediator or face-to-face mediation or other elements, but they didn't describe that in the study, we're not able to make the connection that they might have used it. So authors really do need to do a better job, scholars need to do a better job of truly describing, again, these processes of what's going on. And that will help us to better analyze methodologically, what exactly is happening, better understand what's actually happening inside that black box. So I want to end on a positive note here, because really our strongest support for victim and participant was for victim and participant non-delinquency outcomes. Again, around fairness and satisfaction, we saw that overall, participants were very happy with being involved in these programs and processes. And so that begs the question of maybe procedural justice is at work here. It's possible that, for the youth participants being involved in these programs and feeling that they've been treated fairly and are satisfied with these programs may potentially have an impact on their future behavior. This also brings up the point that potentially reducing delinquency might not be the biggest benefit of these programs. The biggest benefit of these programs may in fact really be these non-delinquency outcomes. So that concludes my presentation today. Just want to thank everyone again for being here. And my email address is provided. And I also wanted to provide a citation to our recently published article on this topic. If anyone really wants to get into it and learn a little bit more, I definitely encourage you to check it out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kimbrell. This was awesome. There is so much information to be digesting right now. So I also feel and understand that the audience here is saying we need some time to process. So thank you for all of your questions so far. Please continue putting those in the Q&A. We'll get to what we can. But we'll shift into our informal conversation session here and just ask a couple of things. So first, we wanted to know, are there gaps? You've kind of spoken to this a little bit about what gaps are currently existing in the restorative justice evaluation literature. So where should researchers and then their practitioner partners focus next?
Yeah, I think given the popularity of these programs and these promising results overall, that really should encourage more rigorous studies being conducted on these topics, more randomized control trials, quasi-experimental studies. And that's, to be perfectly honest, often a ending slide note for most studies on meta-analyses, that we want more of those RCTs and quasi-experimental studies for sure. So I think that certainly is warranted and would be helpful. But yeah, there's all kinds of gaps we could talk about in terms of, even the non-delinquency outcomes. These were based on a smaller set of studies compared to the delinquency outcomes. So I do think that we need more research that's focusing on those non-delinquency outcomes of satisfaction, fairness, and there were many other elements that we found, but we only found, 1 or 2 effect sizes on attitudes about delinquency, things like that, that we need more of in order to kind of better capture those non-delinquency outcomes. One thing that I didn't mention was that we didn't have actually any circle programs. And I feel like circle programs are often considered to be of increasing popularity as well, definitely used a lot more in schools. And that is in part because we didn't include school-based studies. So we did find a lot of circle experiments that were being conducted, but they were specifically in schools. So we did not include those school-based studies. So we didn't have any circle programs, but that's another, type of program, type of restorative justice program that's also really getting, gained attention, gained traction. So that being said, I do think it would be interesting, just overall, not necessarily just focusing on the juvenile justice system, to do some studies and maybe potentially meta-analyses focusing on school-based restorative justice programs and practices for youth. I think that seems like a natural next step. Yeah. And I think one other group is that I think really warrants additional research is that hybrid other group. We saw that really of the groups that had the highest, largest effect size. But that group has a lot of variability in it. And we also need to kind of better understand what is it about these hybrid other groups that, we really need to better understand what's going on there, essentially. And is it because these programs are a little bit more flexible? They're incorporating maybe more elements, they're adapting more to their specific community or context. So I think evaluating and better understanding those hybrid program groups would be a worthwhile effort. Yeah.
Yeah. Your answer here makes me think back to your slide with the Venn diagram and where you said that these things are a little bit more mushy. Mm-hmm. And so that's really where your hybrid and other exist, in that like mushy space across.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. And I think it's also important that you're highlighting here that we're talking about not just understanding the outcomes for the offender or the person who is responsible for doing the harm, but these outcomes for these other groups as well. Is that kind of where you're saying we need to have more of that focus?
Yeah, given the reality that restorative justice programs and practices, often the ones we're looking at are in the juvenile justice space. Of course, we want to look at the outcome of recidivism. That's natural. There might be some restorative justice advocates or proponents that would say that's not a focus of these programs, like we shouldn't be looking at them. But I think it does a disservice to victims that, many victims want to, of course, not see the person that harmed them harm again. But, it does also lead to the point that we want to raise those other non-delinquency outcomes up as well as being equally valuable in evaluating as well.
Yeah. And we had an audience question of if you could provide some examples of what these hybrid and other programs specifically look like, maybe in terms of like the components that they generally include, or is there some type of structure that they typically have?
So I can't really say what the standard hybrid other program was. For anyone really interested in looking at all the studies that were classified as hybrid and other, if you go to our publication, we have a supplemental report that can flag those specific programs. But one of them, for example, combined arbitration mediation with a restitution element. One of them, if I'm recalling, was like a victim offender conference that also encapsulated, I think, not community service, maybe it was like a reparation element as well. So they were blending a couple of different things into one program. But it also included, again, programs that didn't neatly fit into one of the groupings we had. So I think there was also like a victim awareness program as well that was in there. Yeah. So again, need more work done in this space to better understand those hybrid programs.
Yeah, totally. Okay. A different question that we have here, if you were going to design your own restorative justice program based on the research that you've done, this is kind of related to where we've just been talking in this hybrid type space, what are the features that you would absolutely want to include?
Oh, that would be fun. Unfortunately, I can't speak to our results in terms of that meta-regression model I was mentioning, where any specific component was really shown to help reduce recidivism. I think that being said, again, victim offender conference programs, those did show a lot of promise. So I think I would look to elements within, again, a victim offender conference program, and want to use those. So that often includes like a pre-conference or pre-mediation. So preparing the parties beforehand, having them come together face-to-face, including a third party, things like that, coming to a restorative agreement. So I think I would look to those effective programs, or those programs showing showing promise. And want to maybe tease out elements of those if I was focusing on, recidivism outcomes. That being said, in terms of the satisfaction and programs where individuals are often most satisfied, interestingly, those results came from 4 studies, and 3 of the 4 studies were actually from family group conferences, which is really interesting. So I think I would also maybe want to look at what's going on there that maybe is helping people be a little bit happier when they're involved. And my mind goes to obviously family support, right? Including elements of having additional support with you. So maybe, yes, I would blend some of these elements together to create my perfect program.
Yeah, and that point that you just made there at the end of having the family around them, it reminds me of when you were talking to your theory at the beginning, when you talked and you used the phrase respectfully shamed versus stigmatized. So I'm curious if there's something being teased out there that I just wanted to harken back to.
Interesting.
We have so many questions coming in. We're going to get through what we can. The next question we'd like to ask is, was the effectiveness of pre-charge versus already justice involved youth looked at in your meta-analysis? And do you have any results broken out by stage of experience or stage in the justice system?
The quick answer is no. I mean, we looked at, we did look at a couple moderator analyses, essentially. So looking at, whether they were adjudicated or, diverted. And ultimately, we did not find anything meaningful when we looked at that moderator analysis. We looked at moderator analyses for a couple of other things like setting of the program, whether it was in the community versus juvenile justice run, and also unfortunately didn't find anything meaningful there as well. So yeah. Okay. Yeah. So space for more research perhaps, and more information to come through. We had another question come through that asked if there's any research on gang entrenchment and victim empathy in relation to restorative practices. We did not see any studies that focused on gangs in particular. I mean, I would imagine that might be a little challenging to kind of look at in terms of doing a control and treatment group. Seems like a very interesting area, but unfortunately, in our study, we did not have anything that included that specific topic area in relation to restorative justice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, these are really awesome questions that we're just scrolling through here. We had one that came through that asked, It shifted a little bit. What role does or could restorative justice practices have in addressing racial and ethnic disparities within the juvenile justice system? Is there anything promising there in terms of who it was supporting? I know you mentioned that you didn't have enough to code in your studies about gender or race, but I'm curious if you have a sense of whether or not this type of programming can reduce those disparities.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think that's certainly a question that's been posed a lot. In particular, I think with the school space in addressing the, school to prison pipeline and the impact on, zero tolerance policies. So I think especially in the school space, including restorative justice could be a really, valuable tool to be used and used at a younger and younger age as well, helping to start develop some of those conflict resolution skills just for youth overall in general. But I do think, especially I'm thinking of schools now, including restorative justice in the schools to help address some of those disciplinary disparities would be an incredibly valuable tool in addressing that.
Yeah. With that and thinking about like setting and space and schools, we had this question about if your study looked at all at restorative justice programs that happen in virtual spaces. And if you have any sense, I know that you said that a lot of the studies that you looked at the in-person like conferencing. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how that would look in a virtual setting.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And the reality is we completed our search. Our search term was finished in 2020. So just before really, I think if any restorative justice programs were starting to go virtually, they would have needed to be studied and, published right around the exact time we were, starting to do this. So unfortunately, we did not have any that were specifically virtual studies. But it is certainly interesting to think about, using these programs in a virtual way. The reality is, of course, as we've all experienced with COVID and the pandemic, is we do have to learn to adapt some things. I think, though, if I were to go speak to many practitioners that are involved in this space, I don't know how happy they would be to go virtually. I do think there's the element of being in person and that human experience when you're in a room together and you're sharing these powerful stories and things that are happening and feelings and emotions. I think there really is an important element of physically being together. But again, that being said, there are a wide variety of programs and practices. So I think there certainly are elements where maybe we could see what happens when we go virtually. Maybe that expands the availability, or maybe it makes, teenagers or people, in high school more likely to participate. There was a program in the community where I'm from in Fairfax, Virginia, and they needed to add, for example, to their restorative justice programming, like an element of a shoplifting course, because they were finding a lot of issues with shoplifting in their community. So they added a shoplifting kind of required course that participants had to go through. And I think that they did end up having to make it virtual, or they tried to do elements of it that were virtual. So we certainly do see, I think, some need for adaptation, and maybe some of that is going online or going virtual if possible, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that we have time for one or two more questions. We had one that came through that asked if there are relevant groups that have been historically underutilized in restorative justice practices. So I'm thinking that might mean like community groups who have not been brought into the spaces. You mentioned schools are a big part of restorative practices that are not necessarily part of the study that you were able to do, but are there other groups that should be brought into the conversation, possibly from that community portion of the Venn diagram?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, all of these are great questions, and getting me thinking about different things. I mean, I do think that a lot of times many restorative justice programs are grassroots programs. So they do kind of come from the community coming together. Not all of them, but a lot of times they are these grassroots programs that involve the community. And so, but I think it really can vary from program to program, the focus of the program, maybe if like a victim awareness program might bring together victims that want to be involved. I think victims are certainly a group that might be underutilized in, having a say in how they want some of these programs to look, or if they want to be helping to support a victim awareness program that focuses on, for example, domestic violence or things like that. But it's hard to say because there is so much variability. But I'm sure that there are many groups that are underutilized when it comes to kind of drawing from their experience. Yeah.
And something you just mentioned here, you talked about shoplifting, and then you talked about domestic violence. And one question that often comes up with restorative practices is this appropriate for a spectrum of different behaviors? I'm curious if your study was able to talk about, is restorative practices more effective for one type of offense versus another type of offense, or if you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, our study didn't focus on, whether it's more effective for one type of offense versus another type of offense, or more violent offenses. But generally speaking, I think many of us on this call probably know that, especially within the juvenile justice context, a lot of programs are a little bit limiting in that they focus on those first-time offenders, or restrictive, I should say, first-time offenders, potentially lower-level type crimes. And we definitely did find that a lot of the studies included were, had some of those requirements, like first-time offender or low risk. But that being said, there's not necessarily reason to believe that, there were certainly adjudicated youth that were also included in the study, so might have more violent type offenses. Obviously, extreme violent cases are generally never allowed for the types of programs we're looking at. I mean, there are restorative justice programs that go post-adjudication, or that are involved after sentencing and things like that, for those types of crimes. But in terms of what we were looking at here today, often the focus does seem to be on more minor offenses and things like that, or groups. But I don't necessarily think that doesn't mean that we can't say that they might be applicable and valuable for more serious crime types.
Yeah. Thank you. This has been an awesome conversation. We had a lot of questions coming in through the Q&A. Again, if people want to go look and see more about this, you can absolutely go see Dr. Kimbrell's publication. And with that, I want to thank you on the behalf of the YJI and everybody in attendance today, the time that you've taken to share the findings and distill them down for us. And I want to pass it to you for any closing remarks, last final thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much. Again, I just want to thank the Youth Justice Institute and everyone for joining. Those were some really great questions, and also gets me thinking about other areas that I want to continue to explore in this field on this topic. So I'm looking forward as well to reading through some of your comments. But please feel free to email if I can help clarify, or if there are any pressing thoughts in the future. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you. So with some, right before our closing announcements, I would like to ask our audience today how you thought about the webinar, how you felt about the webinar. So we're going to be launching one last poll and ask you to answer that quickly to the best of your ability so we can know how the webinar went. While everyone is answering this question, I do have a few announcements and items to put on everyone's radar. The next Lunch and Learn webinar session will be held on March 28th at noon Eastern with Molly Cook, Dorcas Young, and Joshua Campbell from the National Assessment Center Association about the role of assessment centers in diverting youth at various system points. The link to register should be in the chat momentarily. And save the date, we have Dr. Chris Harding coming to talk about institutions' roles in youth justice contact on April 19th. More to come soon. Immediately following this webinar, we'll be sending a survey out to everybody via email, but it will also be dropped in the chat here. If you have the time, please do complete the survey, as it will allow you to provide further feedback and questions for us. The information will also be used to improve future webinar sessions. The survey shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. Finally, if you've not already done so, feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. The accounts are linked on our website. And as a reminder, the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. In closing, I want to thank all of you for joining us here today at this session of the YGI's Lunch and Learn series. We hope that you've gained some knowledge from this webinar and that you will continue to think about what Dr. Kimbrell has shared with us today. We look forward to seeing you at future events and webinars.